and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin lands of which I'm zooming in from today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the various lands on which we're all meeting today. As usual, if you want to pop your traditional lands in the Zoom chat below. Otherwise, if you're not sure, have a Google. I saw that Age released a really great language thing for just in here in Victoria today, so you can check out one of the native languages on the lands on which you're sitting today. So today, for today's cultural competency class, we're joined by the fantastic Wesa, who I'm really excited to hear from, and I'm sure you all will. She's an insanely accomplished woman, and I think we're all in for a fantastic session. So she's the CEO of Cultural Intelligence and an advisory board member at the National Foundation of Australia-China Relations. She's an influential entrepreneur and a social innovator, a thought leader on cultural diversity and leadership, and has held several senior managerial and government positions. She was also the co-founder of Resilience Against Racism to support multicultural communities, in particular Asian Australians, as well as contributes to social cohesion and harmony in Australia. She was named the 2020 40 Under 40 Most Influential Asian Australians under the education category, as well as an inductee into the Victorian Honour Roll of Women 2012 for her commitment to gender equality, cultural diversity, and social cohesion. She's currently undertaking her PhD, which I just heard about and you'll all hear about. It sounds insanely fascinating, about political and cultural skills, as well as holding a Master in Business Management, a graduate diploma in law, a Bachelor of Engineering in Commerce with majors in software engineering and marketing. All disciplinaries covered, so phenomenal. I'm always so focused on the one thing. I'm like terrible at challenging myself. As well as a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a qualified teacher. So thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand it over to you and I'll stop talking so we can all hear from you.
Thank you, Kate. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners in where I'm standing. So I'm on Wurundjeri land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and those who might be in this call today as well. Thank you, Kate and the Trobe Asia for the invitation to speak about cultural competency and also how to work in the Indo-Pacific region. And also lovely to see so many friends today as well. So hello to you all. I might just start sharing my slides if that's okay.
Go for it.
There we go. Yeah, so a little bit about cultural intelligence. So I help organizations understand cultural diversity and how that impacts on their work in a practical way, and the considerations that might needed. And so in this case, we'll be talking about diplomacy, cultures, and how cultures in the Indo-Pacific region might impact on that, some of the commonalities, differences, and we'll be talking about it from the context of cultural values. And you'll also find that there are many differences between Australia and many different countries in the region, and they are mostly different on every single cultural value we'll be discussing. Now, this is quite important because when it comes to comparing cultures between Australia and, say, European countries, the differences are not as great. The gap is not as great. And obviously, you know, with every single one of these topics, I do have longer workshops which I talk a little bit much more in detail, but given the short time frame, I will discuss some of these concepts briefly. And so basically today we're here trying to understand cultural values and diplomacy. And so the way I structured it is to look at it from a context point of view, relationship building and communications. And so within that, that's actually part of my framework for political skills. So, and political skills, I look at it from how we influence and how we influence and basically assert power. And so that's kind of related to how we do diplomacy as well. So cultural values or cultural dimensions, some people call it, has been very well researched since the 1980s to highlight differences between countries. And it's usually discussed mainly in the context of expats going to new markets for businesses. What is different between some of the context of expats in the 80s and what we know now as cultures in different countries have shifted? So what I'm presenting today are stereotypes, especially when I talk about country norms. But do note that every country are changing, especially when it comes to cultures, and that includes Australia. So we're becoming more and more multicultural, and also young people in countries might have studied overseas. They may not necessarily, follow the traditional values. And so be aware of some of these differences as well. But I still find some of these cultural values very useful as an educational tool. Just be aware that everybody is unique and they're individuals. So there will always be people in countries that do not exhibit the behavior that I'll be talking about. So it's advisable that sometimes when we use these stereotypes, don't use it as a predictive tool. So use it as an educational tool to understand differences, but don't predict people just because they're from that particular country. But then if you observe certain behavior and you're not sure why, the discussion today might give you some insights. And so you might be able to find different ways of addressing it. Another aspect that I do want to talk about when it comes to cultural diversity is about the flexibility, how flexible you are when working across cultures. And when we talk about cultural values, it's not really what you do on autopilot. So sometimes if you don't think about it, you're on autopilot. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not flexible either. So the more flexible you are when it comes to cultural differences, it's easier for you to work in a new context. So on the scale of all the different cultural values, if you're really flexible, it means that it's easier for you to work in a different context. But if you're not flexible, it doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means that you have to work harder in order to do it. And it requires more conscious effort to do that. And so in my business, I developed a tool to help people and coach people to understand their own flexibility about cultural values and what needs to be discussed as well. And I do want to say that cultural values, there's no good and bad with the cultural values. It's just the way they are and how people look at the way they do things. So first of all, we'll go into the context and contextual differences. And the first cultural value we're talking about is power distance. Now, obviously, when it comes to structural differences, we might be talking about political structures or legal structures, but obviously we won't be talking too much into that today. But I'll be focusing on the cultural aspects of the power structures. So the cultural expert and researcher Gert Hofstede did a study to understand power differences and found that there are many countries have higher power distance, and there are countries with lower power distance. So in Australia, we're a society with low power distance, and many countries in the Indo-Pacific are more high power distance countries. And what that means is people in the region respect hierarchy much more readily we do in Australia. And that has quite strong implications when we talk about diplomacy. So for example, in Australia, we like to work in teams, and in diplomacy, we might even, we'll listen to junior staff who might have different perspective on regional security or politics. But then in countries that respect hierarchy more, it may mean that the junior staff in the team might be less comfortable speaking up at meetings. There might be more barriers to them speaking openly about their perspectives. So reflecting on the Australian ASEAN Emerging Leaders Program that I helped coordinate at AsiaLink, there was a roundtable we had with 30 young leaders from across Australia and ASEAN countries with the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. And in that particular roundtable, it's interesting because very few of the ASEAN participants ask questions because they're not necessarily used to present their opinions openly. So there are different ways around it. And one way is to give people roles and brief people to prepare questions. And so it's almost like a permission, like it gives them permission to speak in front of people, in front of authorities and people with status. And I've also seen this in my own experience on a high level dialogue between Australia and China, where and people who've been on these dialogues might also notice that Chinese officials tends to have their prepared speech. Everyone has a role, are given the role, and people are not expected to speak outside of these roles. And it is due to, part of that is due to the power difference and the expectations that also come with it. And I remember at that dialogue, I spoke up at a session on politics. And it was interesting to look at some of the look on the delegates from the China side, because after that particular session during the break, everybody wanted to know who I am, thinking I'm this influential person that they must know, because they wasn't really expecting me to be speaking up at a session where it should be the political leaders that should be speaking. So again, there's no right and wrong. It's just a perception that people had. It was just really interesting, the response that I had right after it. It also impacts on how you might address people. So you might address people using, ambassadors, professors, and your title. So in Australia, we can call our Prime Minister Scotty if we see him at the pub, but that would never happen in other countries. And so also why sometimes we hear stories where people in Thailand, for example, for getting arrested for being disrespectful to the king. But then at the same time, obviously people in some countries are aware of our relaxed nature. And so if they know about Australia and Australians, they might start calling each other by their first names as well. So I've seen that in Malaysia, for example, where there are many Malaysians who've studied in Australia and aware that Australia tends to be a little bit more relaxed. But at the same time, the first time I meet or email a person, I always make sure that I use their titles correctly. So just to give you an insight into a country norm, I put it into 2 boxes, but obviously when it comes to power distance, it's a spectrum rather than 2 boxes. And you can see that most countries in the Indo-Pacific region are high power distant countries. So the next aspect I want to talk about is time orientation. And this is also about the contextual difference, how we actually see time. In Australia, we see time as linear, but many countries in the Indo-Pacific region see time as less linear. And India being quite a standout example, and sometimes we always talk about people being on Indian time. And so what that means is in India, they might have much more interruptions in the course of the day than we do in Australia. And even if you have a meeting organized, people might not necessarily be there at that particular time. Things might get shifted because of something. And so if you organize meetings, people might not actually be there on time, and being flexible in the way you see these meetings. It's probably less of a problem when it comes to government interactions when ministers are involved, but I know it still happens. So in some of these countries, deadlines might become a guide rather than a rule. So organizing back-to-back meetings in a different country is probably not necessarily a good thing to do. You need to allow for that flexibility. just to give you a perspective on, you know, which countries might have more linear time and non-linear time. But again, it's a spectrum. It's not necessarily black and white. Relationship building, it's another area I do want to focus on. And I'm sure people who've worked in the region or been in the region would have heard that relationship is quite important. But today I do want to bust one myth, and that is that relationship only matters in those countries. That's not true. Relationship also happens in Australia, but it's just that there are nuanced differences between Australia and all these different countries. So today we'll be talking about the fundamental differences between relationship building in Australia and those in the region. And when I say relationship building, it's really about how we actually build trust. So how we build trust with other people. And in Australia, we've all heard about the old boys club. And what that really means is important decisions happen in some of these networks. So AFL, Grand Prix at corporate boxes. So in the past, only older men can access them. So young people, women, or culturally diverse people are mostly excluded from these networks. So if you wanted to advocate for something, you might invite a minister to a game. And then you can, you know, do your advocacy in those spaces. But in Australia, you know what they are, you know what it looks like. And even if you don't know how to access them, you might actually be able to find someone who knows how to access them. So accessing those spaces becomes a little bit easier. But if you work in the region, it's similar, but except you're now the minority. So you don't have access to these networks as easily as you would in Australia. So you need to build those trusts with people so that the people will introduce you to those spaces. Otherwise, you can't get access to them as easily. So relationship building is not unique to the region, is really everywhere. The only difference is how you build trust in the region might differ. And so that's basically what we'll be talking about. So first of all, we'll be talking about social orientation, and that's basically how we build social connections. Many societies are more collective in nature, and in Australia, we're more individualistic. And so what that means is when it comes to building trust, it's much harder to access decision-making circles and spaces in a collective culture, because unless you're in the tribe, it's harder to get that access. Whereas in an individualistic culture, it's easier to find ways to access them because you are, you know, you don't necessarily need to be within that tribe in order to access. So just to bring it closer to home to understand that a little bit more, even Sydney and Melbourne has a little bit of that in a more minor way. So in Melbourne, people describe us being more collective, more community. And you also see you know, older family groups that exist in Melbourne as well. So in order to access some of these elite groups, you may need to get to know those traditional families in Melbourne. Whereas in Sydney, people are described as being more entrepreneurial and also more individualistic. So, and I hear this from people who start businesses where it's easier to access groups in Sydney than they do in Melbourne. So it's actually quite interesting to see that there are differences even in Australia. So, but the difference when you talk about moving overseas is that it's 10 times or 100 times more different between Australia and other countries in the region. So, but if you observe closely when it comes to collectivism and individualistic cultures, you can look to Melbourne and Sydney and look at that slight differences. So I guess if you're trying to influence the government in a different country, it's really about knowing them and building that trust. And also having people who can introduce you is really important. And so when I was in Malaysia, I was able to meet with some government officials, because I've had people who were able to introduce me to these people. Now, obviously, official channels are still very important when it comes to government relationships. But then when it comes to people relationships, or when you're trying to build a network in a different country, it's really all about the relationships and who you know, in order to be able to be introduced to those people. And again, country norm. So you can see that Australia is by itself, being individualistic versus the collective societies of other countries in the region. So decision orientation is another aspect that relates to how we make decisions, whether it's universal or not. So in countries, in certain countries, decisions tend to depend on circumstances and who's involved, what the circumstances are. Whereas in Australia, we tend to have those rules and we keep to those rules. And Japan is also one of those countries where they've got the rules and tend to keep to those rules. And in certain countries, rules could just be guides. So it can be bent depending on who's involved. So, for example, if you're in India or Indonesia, for example, if there's a red light, people might not necessarily follow the traffic rules. Whereas in Australia, I know, even at night when there's no cars around, I still, abide by those traffic light rules. So that's kind of how it might impact on society. So these are some of the country norms in the region. So the next aspect we're going to be talking about is communication, and there are two types of aspects to communication, and that's communication style and emotional expression. So when it comes to communication style, there are two types of communication style, direct and indirect. So in Australia, we tend to be more direct and tend to go straight to the point. Whereas in countries, many countries in the region, they might not go straight to the point. It might be very indirect. They might talk to you about the context first, tell you a couple of stories before going to the point, or sometimes not even going to the point. And so in discussions when it's very indirect, you might need to ask clarifying questions to understand what people are saying. And also it can be quite contextual as well. So context can be quite important when it comes to communication style. And they might also be a little bit more passive when dealing with conflicts as well, rather than actually dealing with it head on, and might try and avoid it, going around it, not addressing it. And sometimes you might also see people saying yes, but they might not mean a yes. So a yes could be yes, a real yes, or yes, I heard you, or yes, I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'm going to still say yes anyway, or yes, but really no, or yes, I'm just trying to be polite. So all these yeses have different tones and body language that you might need to read in order to understand, and might need to ask other clarifying questions to understand what they're really, really thinking. And obviously their body language say a lot as well, and also the tone of their voice. So if you understand the culture, you'll get a much better understanding of what they actually say. It can become quite interesting when you're on delegations and they don't really say what they mean. And I've actually seen this before where, not on delegations, but on business meetings, where they would, Aussies would say, oh, but they said yes. I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure if they actually mean the yes. And some people obviously would find this really annoying and find that quite disrespectful. But for people living in those countries, it's actually about being polite. So it is it's basically how respect might be expressed quite differently. So they want to be polite, so they don't want to say no to you, and also being open to being turned to a yes as well. So that could be one of the reasons why they would do this as well. Again, country norms, most countries in the region tends to be a little bit more indirect. Again, it's a spectrum, and obviously in diplomacy circles, people tend to understand indirect communication a little bit more as well. And if you're in business, especially business in Australia, they tend to be a lot more direct. So there are obviously that difference as well, depending on where you work, in what industry you work in. Emotional expression is the other one that differs. And in Australia, we tend to be more expressive compared to those, many of those in the region. But then if we compare Australia and say Greeks and Italians, Anglos tend to be less expressive than the Europeans. So again, like this is on a scale and a continuum. But then countries in the region tend to be a lot more non-expressive, rarely talk about emotions, and can be seen as more stoic. So what it means is if you're in places like Australia, in Japan, for example, you might show less affection and use more critical languages than we do in Australia, and we tend to be a little bit more verbally effective, I guess. But then there are other countries as well, like the Filipino and Pacific nations tend to be quite expressive. So we do have quite a spectrum in the region as well when it comes to emotional expression, and so to be aware of these differences. So if you're working with people from non-expressive countries, they might appear as poker face to you. So you might not be able to read what they're saying. And I know when I was younger, people used to say to me that they can't really read me. So I reckon if I actually stayed in Asia and was raised in Asia, I'd be less expressive. But then obviously working in Australia, you kind of learn to become a little bit more expressive so people can actually read what I'm saying. So that's pretty much it. So in summary, we've covered, a discussion between Australia and other countries in the region in different cultural values, and hope that's been useful, and happy to take any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that one, Wesa. That was extremely informative. I think we all learned a lot about a lot of the regional difference, and particularly I think your example of the ASEAN Australia thing you organised at Asia Link and Malcolm Turnbull was a really great example. I might kick us off with questions, but in the meantime, if anyone wants to think of questions, I'll pop them in the chat. But how do you think perhaps some of these kind of cultural competency things might be a little bit different as we're emerging more online in these types of kind of Zoom diplomacy sessions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because I think when we see people, it's a little bit easier to manage it when you don't actually get to see people. So if, for example, the emotional expression is actually quite an important one. If you're working with people who are less expressive and they're on Zoom and that you can't read them, they have no expression or very little expression. It's already hard enough on Zoom. Even if you are expressive, it doesn't really show already. And then if you're working with people who are even less expressive, then you literally don't read them. And to be honest, like even for me, like I would prefer to not be on Zoom. Like I prefer not to see people's faces. So I'm just listening to their voice. So I mean, that might be a way to practice, to not look at their face, or not allow the face to be a distraction, I guess, and really trying to listen to the message, as opposed to base everything on what you see on the screen.
Awesome. Thank you for that one, Danielle. I can see you popped a question in the chat. Did you want to ask that one?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in the current geopolitical situation, I was just wondering to know your opinion. To what extent does CQ, or cultural intelligence, or a lack of cultural intelligence, play in diplomacy or ineffective diplomacy?
That's a really good question, because I remember, I mean, even just being on some of these dialogues, I've actually noticed that the what do you call it? The body language actually impacts on our diplomacy. And in one particular situation, I see people communicating things in such a way that I can see it can be read in a really negative light. I know that's not the intention of the person who spoke, but I guess that's not the point. The point is it will be received in a really negative light, and so it makes it really hard when it comes to it's whether or not, when it comes to politicians and ministers, whether they're actually communicating to the domestic audience or international audience, and it can be perceived differently. And so that makes it really, really difficult for people who are, trying to work in these spaces, where when you make a speech, are you actually talking to the Australians, or are you actually talking to, people overseas? And there's no way of doing it together, because it will be perceived in a different way depending on how you actually deliver those messages. So it does become really, really difficult.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I can see that we've got lots of questions in the chat there. So let's go to Erin, and then Artie, and then Lena.
Hi, how's it going?
Hey.
I actually have an inquiry as well, but only if there's time. I'm not sure how interesting everyone else would find it. But my question was, I'm kind of interested to know what level of, how true you think it is that digital spaces are changing cultures more rapidly, and therefore changing cultural diplomacy, or making it more globalized, or just shifting it in a way that feels fundamentally different to the way that cultures shifted before there was this level of density of communication online.
So what do you mean by the communication? Like, what aspects of the communication?
I don't necessarily mean one-on-one Zoom sessions. I'm sort of talking about how cultures take place in these international digital spaces, and cultures become more aware of each other and pick up more of what different values, and whether or not when I studied this in undergrad, the kind of tone was that this is quite significant. And I'm really interested to hear from someone who's working in the industry whether you find that to be true.
So I do think that when we start to move things online, people do tend to find their own groupings in terms of how they prefer to be communicated. So in many ways, you start to see, like, it does give rise to, for example, say, Asian Australians prefer certain communication methods, and therefore they tend to, stick within their little group. And sometimes, they might be able to also find circles overseas, like Asian Canadians or Asian Americans, and find a little group amongst themselves. So it does change in that way. In many ways, it gives them an opportunity to find spaces that they didn't in the past. through digital means. I'm not sure if I'm actually answering your question, but I guess, yeah, so that's something that I have seen when it comes to digital spaces and how that might impact on culture and how that might impact on communities.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that one. And Archie, you're next.
Hi, Wesa. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I feel like you've touched upon my initial questions answer a little bit already, so I might sort of change it up. I'm going to paint a picture because of like sort of how globalized things are and how easy it is, I guess, for everyone to move and immigrate to different countries, especially, say, for example, a country like Australia. If I paint a picture where, 10 years from now, diplomats in every country are not, originating from that country, they're actually, dual citizens or actually coming from mixed heritage. How do you see sort of this, globalization changing the way diplomacy happens 10 years from now?
I actually don't know the answer to that question, to be honest. But I guess what I think would be, one of the things that I've been working on is really trying to increase cultural diversity in Australian politics, to have more voices, I guess, of people who understand different cultural backgrounds to be involved in policy making and to be able to understand how, for example, certain messages might be perceived, or when it comes to immigration, whether or not certain immigration policies can be seen as discriminatory towards people of certain cultural backgrounds. And I do think that if more countries are able to understand culture and culture generally across the world, we would probably be able to have much better negotiation outcomes. Because if you understand how people prefer to negotiate, then you're a little bit more flexible in your approach to negotiation, for example. And that's not just Australia, that's across around the world as well. So, diplomats in China should know much more about how Australians do negotiations as well. Or Indian politicians should know how Australian politicians prefer to communicate and negotiate. So this is not just about Australia being more responsive to the world, but it's also about every single country being more receptive to these cultural differences and be able to understand how that might impact on the negotiation outcome. So so in my PhD research, when I talk about political skills, is really about the outcome. So it's not, forget whether or not people think whether certain policies are right and wrong, but then if you want to have an outcome that's good for your country, you need to be able to negotiate your way through those ideas. And so in order to have those outcomes that people want to see in those international relations and international negotiations, we need people to understand cultural diversity.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that one. And Lena.
Thank you. Hi, Wesa. Thank you for your
presentation.
I'm wondering if there's anything that we can do as young professionals in rather junior positions to facilitate conversations between two people in very different who have very different cultural backgrounds. So, for example, I'm French and I spent some time in South Korea. And while there, I witnessed some business meetings between French and Korean business people. And I could see that they really didn't, the Korean people were doing certain things that I understood because I've studied Korean and lived in Korea. But the French people who didn't know anything about Korea kind of didn't, they missed some of the things that were going on. And there was quite a bit of tension there. So I'm wondering if there's anything you can do when you're in that situation, where you're in a junior position, to like step in and do something, or should you just step back and watch it kind of?
You mean as a junior person observing some of this, whether or not there's something you can do?
Yeah,
or
like, yeah, if you're in the room and you're part of the meeting, but you're quite junior, if you can do anything to kind of facilitate that conversation, because you know kind of both cultures, or if it's not your place to do that, then you should just back off.
Yeah, I mean, I would, but then not necessarily doing it at the meeting. Actually, there are certain things you can do at the meeting. So one thing you could potentially do is to, say, oh, I've just heard this and I heard that, and I think that has been misunderstood, or I think, this is what this person is saying. So jumping in to be kind of like the person to explain it. But if that's not possible, and sometimes it's not possible, it could be during the break, talking to the organizers to say, hey, this is what I've just observed. Is there something that can be done? But having said that, though, I've seen some people might still ignore it, but at least you've done something. So I think from a person who really wanting to build those bridges, you want to know that you've actually done everything you can to assist in those circumstances.
Great, thank you.
Perfect, thank you so much for that one. And Tom, your question.
Cheers, Kate, and thanks for that, Wesa. That was a really great and informative presentation. From your experience, how do you think Australia is regarded in the region in terms of like what you've been talking about, cultural sensitivity and that type of thing? Obviously we've got some horrific baggage with like the White Australia policy, and in like recent decades, there was a lot of hope that Australia would kind of embrace the Asian century and get Asia literate with languages and things, but that hasn't really happened. So like, do you think those across the region see this as a kind of a laziness, or I guess an apathy of Australia, and not genuinely trying to kind of engage with our neighbours? And also kind of related to that, like, do you think Australian tourism to Asian countries and the behaviour of the tourists there, things like that, do you think that has a net positive or negative impact on how Australia is perceived? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a huge question, because I think it really depends on who you're speaking to, which country you are actually in. So it's all different. But I remember, I think one of the things that we need to understand is if there are certain things that are happening in Australia, it does send messages back in some of these countries as well. So I remember around 2009, when there was all the incidents of international students bashing, especially bashing of Indian students at the time. I know around that time, a lot of people in the Indian community, so people in India, asking their kids whether or not they're going to be safe. Is Melbourne safe? Do you need to come home? It has that international impact. And again, now with the pandemic, with some of the racism happening with Chinese communities, again, there are people, like even my parents have migrated in Australia, but they're mostly in Hong Kong. They would ask me, oh, are you going to be safe? Are you going to be abused on the street, for example? So things like that, especially when it comes to media, they tend to exaggerate some of the instances as well. So the perspective would be, you've got a lot of races in Australia, so it's not safe for people from different cultural backgrounds, which obviously we know is not necessarily true. And I think it also depends on, because there are some diplomats in Australia that really know their stuff as well. So I think we know that there are really good diplomats, and I've watched Frances Adamson, our ex DFAT head. So she's very, very good, especially when it comes to working with China. And I'm sure, you know, in other countries as well. So I think when you have people like that, they know how to work in some of these countries. They know how it works, but then it's not necessarily replicated across the organization. So you might have a couple of people who are really, really good. And if you happen to have those people in those key roles, then it's great. But then if you have people who might not necessarily be that good, then that's when you're going to have problems. So it really depends on who you get, and to be honest, it's not necessarily flowing through the whole of organization either. So if you've got some really good, there's only a handful of really good ones, and I think that's partly the problem. Whereas I do think that we do need more people, not necessarily just in DFAT, but in other organisations, other government organisations as well, with those perspectives and skills.
Definitely, and kind of teaching them across the board and having a few people who excel at it. I think that lands quite nicely with Catherine's question.
Hi, I was wondering if you could please expand on kind of the role of learning a new language or an Indo-Pacific language for cross-cultural collaborations.
So I think learning language is important because language is often merged with culture. But also at the same time, language is not everything. So you might understand the language, but not necessarily quite understand the culture. And so I think I see them as together, but kind of separate at the same time. Because obviously, you know, the culture is embedded. Language is embedded in the culture. But then at the same time, even if you don't necessarily know the language, you should be able to pick up on cultural aspects as well. But then if you understand the language, there are many different sayings. So if you go to all the different cultures and you understand some of the sayings that they use, that is a reflection of their culture. So I do think that we should be encouraging more people to learn a language and also learn the language in that country, because sometimes you pick up certain things that you would never pick up in a classroom. And also the other thing is, in Australia, we actually do have a lot of communities from those cultures to I guess to bring more bridges between those communities and the language learners, because at the moment they seem to be like, you know, two separate things, where you've got your language learners, but then they don't necessarily engage with, say, you know, if you're learning Bahasa, you don't necessarily engage with the Indonesian community in Australia. So I think we need to, you know, find a way to bridge the two.
Awesome, thank you. That was a really insightful answer. So we'll go to Lachlan next.
Thanks, Wesa. I completely agree with you on the bridge between learners and community. I just wanted to ask whether Australia holds a diplomatic sort of advantage over some nations that are less multiculturally diverse, just in the way that I guess Australians, mostly in the metro areas and stuff, have more experience with people from other nations.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we have the potential to, but no, because we don't see multicultural people in those roles. So anecdotally, I know that, for example, Asian Australians are not promoted in certain roles within government departments, or it's much harder for them to be promoted in those roles. So if we don't see them there, they can't really necessarily contribute their perspective. And you can't just have one. I mean, we know with women, like, you need a critical mass of people who understand what you're talking about in order to influence. And so if it is just, say one person of Indian background and, talking about the Indian policy, and that person is really trying to influence it, but they can't if everybody else in the room don't agree. So if we start to make use of our multicultural talents, I think we can, and that's what I think we need to head towards.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that one. And let's move on to Eloise's question.
Hello, Elise. I didn't see you before.
Hello. Such a great presentation. This is a question that maybe sounds a little bit obvious, but I suppose if you think about it from someone like a young professional, Australian professional like myself, about to embark on a project with, say, a partner from the region, I was wondering your top tips for that person who is working within an Australian context, Australian expectations to get that work done, and yet the partner is from, a completely different culture. How, what would be the sort of first sort of things that come to mind that you would sort of suggest that we would do?
Yeah, so that's also a really, really good question. So when it comes to project management, and I've done quite a few of them, especially working with people from different cultural backgrounds, so I tend to set earlier deadlines to allow for flexibility. So I rarely tell them the absolute deadline, just so that, you allow for a little bit more time. And also working flexibly as well. So, not doing things in linear ways. So if you haven't got certain things from certain people, that you work on something else first, so that as soon as the information comes through, you can just insert the information. And yeah, so working flexibly is probably the number one tip. And yeah, don't set deadlines that are too strict.
I love it. Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So, and also as someone young professional who is also managing that project, but dealing with, the power distance as well. But we need to get these things done. Like, what's the tip there?
I don't know whether or not you can work with your manager to find a way to do it, so that because there might be certain things that they need to do. There might be official communications that they need to send, and so maybe your role is to also manage your manager to say, okay, well, can you send this through, but I've prepared the email for you, that type of thing. So yeah, being aware of that, it's quite important.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that one. I like the tip about not having deadlines. If only Beck was here, maybe I could squeeze out of some of my deadlines. All right. So TC, you've got a question.
Hey, I was just wondering if you'd be able to expand on some of the differences between business and diplomacy cultures in the region. Like, have any examples of where some of the bigger clashes might lie?
Yeah, so in terms of business, so I think when it comes to diplomacy, the power distance is a really huge one. When it comes to business, time, how people see time is probably more important. because deadlines, meeting times doesn't always apply. So collectivism apply in every aspects of culture. So that's probably something that will be implied everywhere. And like I said, when it comes to communication style, if you work in diplomacy, it's probably people are probably used to more indirect communication anyway. Whereas the difference between businesses would be much greater when it comes to direct communication and indirect communication. Emotional expression is, again, in diplomacy, you're probably going to be less expressive anyway. You're probably more structured in the way you interact with different parties. And so in businesses, you might find that one to be, an important one to be much more aware of. Decisions orientation is probably going to impact businesses a lot more as well, because it's really up to the person who you're working with and how they might make decisions themselves. Whereas in diplomacy, when you're working between government and government, it's number one, in diplomacy, you might actually be having a conversation but not making a decision. And if you are making a decision when it comes to government to government, there's lots and lots of communications behind the scenes already. So there are a lot more processes in between. And so if, for example, two countries have decided to sign something, you're not going to last minute say, oh, hang on, my mother wants to change certain things. And so, so I think, with that particular area, it's probably going to impact businesses a lot more.
Perfect. Thank you for that. That was super informative. I know we've got people here from across government, think tank, and private sectors. All right, Ashton, I think it'll be the last question if you want to go.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you so much, Wesa, for your presentation. So my perception is that actual practical cultural competency training is still quite a new kind of concept. So what do you think needs to change or to happen so that, more people kind of in universities or professional life have access to more nuanced and comprehensive cultural competency training?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It might be a question for Kate, actually. How do we actually bring in more, the practical element to cultural competency? Because I know for many years, I've seen a lot of the research being done, and it's great to know the research, but if you can't apply it, it's just really difficult, because cultural competency is really about how you actually work with other people. It's really not about the research. It's nice to have the research, it's interesting, but so I would love to find ways to actually bring more of that into universities and also businesses and other circles as well.
I think it would be great. I know in my undergraduate, I didn't learn any of these skills, and these seem more applicable than learning about theory written hundreds of years ago.
Yeah. So thank you, Kate, for the invitation to speak at this in this group.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and as well, Wesa, for all of your words on cultural competency, relationship building, power. I think everyone gained a lot from it. I know I've been frantically writing, and I can see everyone else doing the same as well. I might be the annoying daggy person and ask for a photo for social media. So if you want to, feel free to pop on your camera. If not, that's totally fine. So let me know when you're all good. Everyone's adjusting their hair. All right, I'll do a countdown. 1, 2, 3. All right, amazing. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Wesa. Again, I hope you all have a good day, and we'll see you all next week for the start of our dialogues. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, Wesa.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Wesa.